So, my panelist, welcome. Great. So I guess it's our turn. So let's go round and do some introductions. So let's start with Wendy.
Hi there. My name is Wendy. I'm currently the DevSecOps managing advisor at Experian. My background actually started off in infrastructure, networks as a network architect before moving into security and currently advising on a global transformation engagement for DevSecOps for Experian.
Super, great. Let's move over to Katie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Gamanji, and I'm one of the cloud platform engineers for American Express. As well, you might know me in my capacity as one of the TOC for the CNCF. And in that role, I'm going to focus a lot on the governance of open source projects and enabling projects to join the open source community. As you noticed, my role is not security focused. I am here to actually give an overview of the spectrum of how the security is consumed by the end users. So I'm going to pretty much share all the pains and all the kind of interaction and practices that we use on the other side of the security.
Thank you. We like to have a balanced view in the panel. Let's go over to Steve.
Cool. Thanks, Michael. If I go way back, I started as a C coder, and then from there I progressed through looking at process control, process quality in manufacturing, oddly, and then code quality. And then from code quality, it was kind of a natural step to get into security, application security. And now I focus primarily on the cloud native application security. Word of warning, I work for a vendor. So I'll bring that perspective.
We won't hold that against you, Steve.
Thank you.
Grant, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Grant. Yeah, I come from a very security-sided perspective. I worked in consultancy for many years now, doing traditional activities like pen testing and code review and that kind of stuff. More recently, I've been working with NowSecure as part of the research team there, helping build solutions that do like CI/CD and SAST and DAST and other things. So kind of got a mixed bag of experience, but certainly my background's more on the offensive side. And it's really useful to kind of see different perspectives now, because historically there was always like an us and them mentality, whereas events like these showcase that like we can do really great things if we start working together. So super excited to be here.
Great, thank you. And over to my good friend Ashraf.
Hey, Michael, thank you. So yeah, I'm currently working at Schroders as the global head of security architecture, operations and engineering. So I've got a very wide remit. Technical background, started up network security, a bit of pen testing, cyber consultancy. I've been involved in the response to large scale attacks and incident responses for clients such as TalkTalk and Swift, Bangladeshi Heist, etc. So I've had a good experience on what the lack of security in organization does. So yeah, so I can give maybe some little stories maybe.
That's great. And a quick introduction of myself. So Simon obviously mentioned that I'm the founder and organizer for DevSecOps London Gathering. I'm also an independent consultant working with a lot of FTSE 100 clients to factor in security toolings and security into their delivery lifecycle. So on that note, thank you, everybody. And thank you for DevSecCon for inviting us. We're the European panel. I was asked to give the panel a title, so I quickly came up with the joys of integrating security testing into your pipeline. I think one of you guys said that there was a hint of sarcasm in that title, and you're probably right. So, as the title mentions pipeline, one of the first points I would like to talk about is the term pipeline. So you hear this a lot within our industry, within companies, and I think there's a lot of different meaning or definition of that term. So a lot of people feel that the pipeline is actually just the technical aspect of your CI part. So for example, Jenkins, which is kind of the glue that would orchestrate all your build and testing, etc. That's the pipeline. But is that the true meaning of pipeline? Personally, I think it should be a bit broader. If we're factoring security, it's not just about the tech. So therefore, your pipeline can't be just about the code promotion, building, compilation, testing aspect. It should really start from the business conception of an idea all the way to delivering that to your customers. But that's my view. What do you think, Ashraf?
Yeah, this is touted out quite a bit. Build pipeline. Everyone has their own definition. So for me, if we're referring to application security, then build pipeline, in my eyes, should and could encompass all software security tests, if possible. Well, if we're looking to shift left in respect to security as a whole, then the build pipeline is somewhat too late. As you're saying, you've skipped the design phase and the business objectives and requirements, etc. So you're only focusing purely on what can be tested within a build pipeline. So, and if you do that, there could be design decisions that can have adverse effect on the defensibility of the application. So, and then in order for you to go back and change that, you're going to slow down the projects, and then your security are going to become the handbrake crew, as we are formerly known as. So, not all security tests can be defined as code, or should I say, not all security it's not that easy to define all security tests as code. So the build pipeline is not necessarily the path to go live. Okay, it's a series of sets purely aimed at software delivery houses, and I think there are a lot of companies out there, a lot of institutions out there that maybe don't actually build a lot of software in-house, and they're trying to do the CI/CD, DevOps, DevSecOps, and they're trying to figure out how can we join in on all these buzzwords, but they can't because they're not developing any software. So they're really trying to desperately trying to squeeze some of this stuff. And then of course I think there's a lot of people going to use it as well. Okay, we're going to put our config as code through our build pipeline, and then our infrastructure as code. And that's where you're starting to get a little bit more now in terms of actually requirements and security test as code. So for me, it's a build pipeline. It's not necessarily the path to live. So that's my interpretation of it. And I think you might feel a bit hard done by if you've followed your build pipeline and everything's going hunky-dory, and then you want to go live, and then security guy or risk guy says no, sorry, we're not finished yet, you still got this big long checklist to go live. So I see it from both from a developer, security, business, product owner perspective, but there's still a lot to be done, and you got to be careful what you wish for. Because if you do want everything defined as code, and you want all your tests defined as code, then essentially you're building up a set of patterns. So therefore we can write that security test as code, and therefore you're going to be probably pigeonholed into a finite set of patterns that we can test you against. So I don't know if actually we want to put everything, all security tests as code. So that's people might not agree with me there.
Interesting. Steve, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, it's hard. I'll start with saying I agree there. But I think there's, it's early in the panel, so let's be positive. So the pipeline for me, to take a way big step back, is kind of where all the business touch points approach getting from software to its inception to its deployment. And there can be a lot of touch points around that where you need to apply security, both in terms of automating tests, but also in terms of, as you said, design, because design is kind of where, I'll say both. There's an argument about how many software security defects enter by design and how much are a result of actual code defects. But I think automation adds velocity to that pipeline. But I think the pipeline can be, in my mind, drawn out as something that's actually quite large within an organization.
Super. It could be, so pipeline value stream mapping is another term that came to my head. And that's probably could be used as a better term to describe the whole end-to-end process. So regarding DevSecOps, people talk about it. People talk about how to integrate it as if it was a tangible thing. But how would we measure this? or articulate the journey. Katie, would you like to share some thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I think measuring how well we do security in any company, it's quite a complicated thing. But I think when it comes to security, the main principle is how quickly we can fix a vulnerability. So it's pretty much can be translated in the mean time to fix. If we find an issue, how quickly can we fix it? And this is pretty much just the surface, the tip of the iceberg, because underneath that, it's a whole kind of cultural shift. It's an entire different paradigm, like when it comes to how we share information, how we do coaching and training. So one of the things which is quite important in how quickly we can fix things is automation. Do we actually have this end-to-end instrumentation possible? How much of our security issues did we kind of cover? How much of it did we cover in code as well? And the other thing is the confidence of engineers of actually jumping into security issue and fixing it. And I think this confidence is coming obviously with the experience, with the knowledge of the system, actually understanding what you're designing, why you just like what kind of is going to be your end users who you're designing it for as well. So I think it's all about the, even if you don't have the knowledge, how can you actually have this collaboration between your team and the security team? How can you have this coaching and cross-pollination? So I think this is, again, something which kind of happens underneath, but again, how efficiently you can do that can determine the way you're actually going to fix and make your system more kind of bulletproof in a way. And I would like to say that this kind of brings me to one of the metrics, which is difficult to measure or to quantify, but it's how well we actually distribute the ownership of security. Because if supposedly a different team or you have a vulnerability being announced, for example, how exactly we jump into this problem? Is it one team dictating to us? Do we need to kind of fix this? They're going to open a ticket in our backlog and it's going to take a lot of time to prioritize it and so forth and so forth. Or me as an infrastructure engineer, I am aware of my products. I'm aware of the tools I'm running onto my platform. And I am kind of always constantly monitoring and being proactive about discovering these issues and actually solving them. And I think this kind of distribution of ownership when it comes to security, it comes again with, well, again, very difficult to quantify, but it's a culture which, once ingrained, is going to bring a lot of benefits towards the entire system and the entire company.
Wow, that's very deep. Anything else to add, Ashraf, on this point?
Yeah, I would say the easiest way to measure is how painful is it, really? You know, how painful is it for the developers and how painful is it for you if you work in those security teams to deal with your counterparts. I think it's easy. It's very, very easy. You know when you've got it right, yeah. So you know when you've got it wrong. It's a shit show. People hate doing the security tests. They fight you, they blame you. But when you've got it right, you've actually been pulled into the conversations. You're being, you can actually put your tools in the critical path. You can force it as a build step, and then you go, okay, well, are we going to go soft or hard gates? Again, talking about from a software development lifecycle and a build pipeline. Once you're there, and you say, okay, well, you need to do these tests. Before you go live, and you can actually, as a security team or as an organization, I'd say, you say, right, everything that goes live, we run it through a set of security tests, and if it fails, it doesn't go live, and as simple as that. You're doing really well there, and I think you've got an incredibly good security standards up, but I don't think there's many people doing that. One thing I'd also say is that I think, as we're talking about this kind of a collective responsibility, we need to probably stop selecting security tools on our own as if it's a product just for us. In fact, we're selecting a product that we're going to measure somebody against, and we're not giving them the inclusion that they need. So we might end up selecting something that isn't fit for purpose and then tell them to use it. and then they're going to complain about it isn't fit for purpose, and then we're going to say, well, yeah, that's your problem, you've got to figure it out. So I think there's a lot to talk about this even before we get into maturity. So, and everybody is, not a single glove fits all. So this is a big topic.
Wow. Okay, so that moves us nicely on to guidelines. So are there any guidelines for selecting tools? Katie, do you want to take this again?
Sure. I think the main guidelines in selecting any tools is to actually, does it fix the problem? That's the main question. I think it's very important to have a predefined set of requirements to actually understand what you're trying to solve and try to find a tool that's going to match most of the issues or most of the things you're trying to fix. And when it comes, I think, to security, I think because it's such a complex topic, from my perspective, from the end user perspective, let's say as a platform engineer, I have to deal with security. I have to integrate it within infrastructure. I think one of the most important thing from our point of view is accuracy. Like, we really want something which is actually going to find the problem in most of the cases, rather than creating a lot of spam into our channels, creating a lot of alarms, and we're just going to be all over. Like, that's false positives is the nightmare of any engineer nowadays. Like, no one wants that. So I think if you find a tool that really can do something really good, like even if it's a small subset, even just like fixes a very, like maybe I would say maybe 40%, but it does it very well, I would prefer that rather than having a tool which is going to fire alarms all the time. And another thing which I think is quite important when we're talking about tooling and security is, does it actually make my deployment process or my stage from being to my local environment to production quicker or slower? Because if it's going to be a tool which is going to bring a lot of complexity, if it's going to fail my pipeline, for example, and I need to spend maybe 2 days, that's exaggerated, obviously. But even if I have to spend 1 hour, 2 hours and deep diving into something, maybe which is like a very small patch or like a very small kind of thing, we don't really, I mean, we're concerned about that, but we don't really want to kind of push back the entire deployment process because of it. It's all about like, how can you measure if it's actually making us efficient? And I think like this is in terms of kind of the practices. Another thing is obviously when you're choosing the tooling, it's I think the question, do we build it in-house or do we pay for it? Do we throw money at the problem? And I think this, I think lately, at least from my experience, what I've seen a lot of companies do, they actually do prefer to get an off-the-shelf product. Obviously, if it's got, again, based on the requirements, and if they solve most of the problems, they're going to go for that, because it's quite difficult to actually get this knowledge and the resources to build a tool in-house, to maintain it, unless you're a security company, which is actually your full-time job. And I think this kind of covers most of the guidelines, maybe when choosing a tool.
Great. I would move to Steve on this point, but I won't. Wendy, would you like to share some of your experience around guidelines and tool selections? You're on mute.
Sure, thank you for that. So very timely conversation, actually. We just, as part of our transformation, we are actually actively doing tool selection. And I think Katie's comment regarding the requirements, I think starting off with a set of requirements for your organization, for your developers, for your management team is absolutely critical. I mean, I think just an analogy, I think we probably all done it, right? So it's sort of, going to the supermarket, you've got all these goods. You go to the supermarket with a shopping list of what you need, or you go to a supermarket when you're hungry, because that's when you actually have a need for this. But it's going to a supermarket when you're hungry, and then essentially just grabbing everything that you have on site. So I think starting off with the requirements, do your due diligence, go through a proper RP process, and then sort of and do sort of a kind of measured selection process through POCs and the like. It's quite critical to make sure that your tool set fits your purpose, especially if we are trying to do DevSecOps. So I think, you know, DevSecOps is sort of reasonably new. I hope I'm not going to get any kind of, you know, sort of, you know, compared to DevOps, right? DevOps been around for, I don't know, like, so about 10 years. So it's a concept that everybody understands. I think previously we had a DevOps and then we have AppSec. So security is very much, you know, as long as we get it, you know, we have a security scan of sorts, then we're done. But with DevSecOps, you're basically trying to apply those DevOps principles to security. So incremental scan as early as possible in development, in your code development, as well as doing threat modeling before, you know, in the planning stage. So you're just basically trying to do everything incrementally and sort of less painful, in a less painful way.
Okay. Almost feels very waterfall-y in terms of tooling selection there, with RFPs, POVs, requirements, etc. But it kind of makes sense. Well, it does make sense. For large organizations, there are guidance, procurement guidelines that we need to follow, you know, scalability in terms of purchasing commercial products. It's all very important. If we select 10 different commercial products, but actually one of them meets 80% of our requirements, as kind of Katie alluded to, then why not do that? And from a licensing point of view, we can that will scale much better. So kind of on the testing tooling side of things, obviously, traditionally we've had within security different types of testing approaches, etc., and methodology. So static analysis, that's been around for years, right? But do you think those approaches actually work within the DevSecOps space? Steve, would you like to take this one?
You dropped a bomb. You won with the static analysis thing. Does it work within the DevOps space? Some do, and some don't. Some, I think, some of the traditional, let's call them ASTs. I don't know, application SAST, IAST. Some still work well in terms of the more higher velocity agile development space. Having come from a few other vendors that maybe were in this space, and having moved into cloud native, that was almost an intentional move to try and keep up. So there's my sort of answer within an answer. I think SAST is a little slow. I think people in the space, people I talk to now, look at it as something that not only is it, well, slow, but if we're applying it to a microservice environment where we're looking at much smaller code bases that by default seem a lot more secure, and then the path through those interactions is very difficult to trace, there are other methods that might be more appropriate. And that's, I think, why you see, when you look at security tooling as it's being developed by CNCF, you see a lot more security tooling that is now being tailored better to this world.
Okay. Wendy, do you have anything else to add to this?
Sure. I think just through the program that we've sort of gone through, we did spend a lot of time talking to developers. So I've not come from a developer background, but I think, you know, you should use as much experience as you have in the company. And in terms of, you know, the tool sets, there's actually a variation in sort of tools which allows you to fit into, you know, which is AppSec, you know, just the scan for the binaries at the end, or tools that allow you to do scans at source code in the IDE, you know, and do incremental scans. So there are, I think, in terms of when you're looking at your, it needs to be based on requirements, but when you look for tools, I think you need to look at what issues that you're trying to address, which tools will fit into, that will fit better in your environment and for your developers. I think, I mean, developer feedback in terms of, you know, allow them to sort of play around with it a bit. I think, you know, not necessarily have to do the RFP before the POC, but, you know, get feedback from them and sort of to say, you know, how effective they think different tools are. I was actually quite surprised when speaking to the team of the sort of variation in sort of tool kind of usability, as it were, from the developer point of view.
Okay, all right. So let's focus a bit on purely application code. So your business application. Let's kind of park aside the infrastructure side of things. So typically within the AppSec world, when you talk about secure coding, etc., you do some risk assessment, threat modeling. You may throw in some static code analysis, which could be expensive in terms of build times, etc. Dynamic analysis, interactive analysis, checking your open source third-party components, and the good old pen testing. So we've got a range of different testing which can fit in at different points within the delivery lifecycle. But if an organization was trying to break into this, let it be a small organization, a startup, or a large enterprise, do we have a preference in terms of what to tackle first or choose first? Grant, would you like to answer this one?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot in there, so I'll kind of break it down into little chunks. But yeah, I think the first thing is like a lot of those activities, fit really well into DevSecOps, and some of them, they do work, but they need a lot of hand-holding. Threat modeling doesn't really fit into an automated world that well. I mean, there's lots of efforts now to do threat modeling at scale and stuff like that. But certainly like SAST and DAST, those things are sort of tried and tested, and we're getting much better at those things. I think it's a combination of those sort of asks that you need, right? If you think of traditional verification, right, not just security, but like product verification, right? If you want to check that there's nothing wrong with the car, then you're going to have to walk around the car, take a look at it. Does everything look okay? Maybe lift up the bonnet. Does everything look okay under the hood? Are the cables connected? Nothing's loose. And that's kind of like SAST, right? You're scanning things offline. You don't really see the data flows. As was alluded to earlier, with microservices, you get like a snapshot perspective, but you don't really see necessarily how everything sort of connects, which is where DAST comes in. Right, and you start to you take the car for a drive around the neighborhood. Do the brakes feel okay? Is the steering off? You can verify it like that. And then I asked kind of like, if you could drive it around and observe everything that's happening, but you could also see the sensors, right? What was the fuel injection ratio? Is the temperature of the engine okay? What are the oil levels? So you're getting all of these kind of metrics from the inner workings of the systems, and it's more interactive, and you see things. These are all things that fit really well in DevSecOps, in my opinion. Things like SCA, I think they're also super important too. I think, especially if you have like large portfolios and you're not doing SCA, then I think it's a really important activity just to see what the lay of the land looks like. Like how much open source are you using? How well updated is that stuff? How vulnerable is that stuff? So I think SCA also has a really important place. Pen testing is it is one of those activities that struggles a bit here. Like the traditional approach of working with development teams and giving them a PDF 15 days later. I don't like to be that guy, but yeah, it's not great, right? People want things in real time. They want integrations with Jira and GitLab and GitHub and stuff like that, where they can start working on the issues and get actioning them there and then, not 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks out. So I think some of these things, do make a lot of sense. And like you said, maybe if you're a smaller organization or a larger organization, that does change a bit. But I think that the important point is that all of these things, are key security activities that you're going to have in your SDLC. What you can put into, pipelines and automate to get really good coverage. That's a bit trickier.
So for a small organization, would you dare to answer or pick one of the testing approaches?
Yeah, I think if you're relatively small, I would say you're probably going to get some quick wins from SAST. It can be as said, it can be slow, and it's not going to give you great coverage. DAST on top of that is going to be even better. So if you can have something that does both SAST and DAST, then I think you're off to a really good start.
That's
You're
IaaS,
never
isn't
gonna,
it?
yeah, exactly. But you're never really going to replace, the requirement to look at threats and risk assess your systems through threat modeling. If you've got critical apps, you're going to need to do that. So I'm hesitant to say, yeah, just use a SAST, or you are going to need those other activities. But yeah, I think you're certainly going to get some good coverage through a combination of SAST and DAST.
Okay. Static and dynamic. Oh, not my choices. But before I share my opinion, Wendy.
So this is, which one would I select?
Yes.
I suppose. Okay. So, I mean, DAS is essentially automated pen test, right? So I think in terms of, if you want to kind of effectively save time, and you're basically doing your you want to review your test in your application in kind of real time, as it were. That is a good option. I'm just thinking about, I think this is probably different for every organization, but a lot of organization, and if you look at lots of, the code in terms of makeup, I think open source is probably one of the key test tools that organization, because if you look at most organizations, and it's not just Experian, right? Just sort of majority of the code are from libraries, open source libraries, right? There's only relatively limited kind of bespoke code which your static analysis engine will pick up. So I think I'll definitely include the SCA, the open source elements in there. It's quite difficult to select, because ideally I like to have it across the board, right? I like to have, it's I want the static, I want the open source, so that and the IaaS is sort of like, it's sort of dynamic, but you kind of know where it is, so you can go in and find vulnerabilities. But I think as a baseline, I think I will go for if it's security testing tools with pen test, I think I would go for static and open source.
I think there's another small consideration there that I would add just quickly before we move on. And a key thing, right, is going to be in organization size is cost, right? Doing pen testing and threat modeling is extremely expensive. Whereas are you going to do a pen test on every build that you churn out 2-3 times a day? No. Like, it's going to cost you a fortune if you try and do that, right? Even if you're doing a pen test a week or a pen test a month, internal or external, these things really rack up in cost. So again, depending on your size, maybe from a cost perspective, some of the other activities make a lot more sense than some of the traditional ones. Not to bash on them, because as acknowledged, they are important.
No.
But cost is extremely important, I think.
So just from my perspective here, guys, I think you got to be realistic as to with your own abilities, the organization's abilities, both the security team's abilities, from because we went from being tech savvy to security savvy, back to being dev savvy, tech savvy, security savvy, dev savvy, security savvy. And as we're bouncing around with those kind of, I'm going to be more of a developer security guy or more of a security pen test guy. All of those things are actually really important these days. So do you have the guys that are actually going to be able, do you have an application security team? Will they be able to interpret the results? Will they be able to assist the developers? Do the developers understand the results, right? So that's that kind of limit what you're going to choose. Maybe I just want to go back to Grant's point about the DAST. I had a good analogy there, because I thought it's not like you're driving the car around the block. It's actually your security team driving the car around the block at full throttle, and then taking it around to the racetrack and giving it a good bashing and seeing how it survives, and then going back to the development team and saying, hey, we injected it with like 1 million requests per second, and we found all this stuff rubbish, so it's a bit unfair. So I think it's so also if you have a single language and you use a single framework, then life is going to be very easy for you, whatever you choose. Either you choose to pen test it, you choose to do DAS, SAST, even if you want to do RASP, it'd be everything's going to be, but the reality is so many things out there, people using so many languages, so many frameworks. we're struggling with security staff that have the development background, that understand this stuff, and so therefore you got to be realistic. Also, what are you trying to defend against? Like, do you want to build a Fort Knox when you're just selling I don't know, plastic toys, but you sell 1 million plastic toys? I don't. What are you trying? I mean, are you trying to get a highly secure environment? But are you really pushing your development team and your business and your product managers to put so much security that it's really unrealistic? So I think that you need to understand what enough security means to your organization, and understand the time that you have to spend on integration and the resources you have, and also the skill set, both from a development perspective and from your developers side, and also from your InfoSec security side. So I think that's also really important.
That's a really great point. Context is very important. Great. Okay, so most of the testing approaches we mentioned earlier are very traditional, as we stated, but obviously in our current lives, everybody has at least one mobile device, right? So if we can access it from our desktops, through our laptops, then it should be available through on your mobile. Now that's a completely different landscape. So the testings that we mentioned earlier, do they actually fit in for a mobile application? Grant, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, I think they do. And I think, like many things, this is like a progressional thing, right? We've been looking at traditional like application security and web security, for decades, literally decades, right? And we still have SQL injection, but I digress. These tools have been built over time. Admittedly, not everything fit into the ways that we work and function as teams now. But many of even the traditional tools do fit into that way of life. The mobile testing approach and the tools around that are certainly there. If you go out, you can find them. Working with one vendor on that just now. But they are, we do as a market have put less time into these tools than the previous decades we spent on other tools, right? So if you're looking at testing a mobile app, you can't just go and use the same old tools that you've been using for the last 15 years, right? You have to go and find something that's fit for purpose. And again, like you said, some organizations may not have a mobile app, but I would dare to think that most organizations now have a mobile app, and if not just having a mobile app, they're probably writing their mobile apps before they write anything else, right? Mobile first. And in which case, right, if most of your business and most of your foot traffic is coming through mobile, then it's going to be equally important to look at that. And I think if you are working in that space, then there's a very high chance that you're working in an agile fashion, and you live and breathe DevSecOps. And I think, again, going back to the previous points about your integrations with bug trackers and getting findings in real time and scanning every build, I think they're certainly ever more common. I've specialized in mobile for many years, and from every customer I've worked with, they do things like pen testing, but all of the solutions now where you can get continuous scanning and test every build with SAST, DAST, and IAST. These are the things that people are really enjoying to use from a development side. And from a security perspective, if we can get coverage as left as possible, and find things earlier, then in the long run, again, that's going to save us money. So,
cool. Anything to add? Anybody on that? Mobile application testing? It's quite niche.
Just make sure you do something.
Yes.
You can't choose. Just do pick and mix, whatever it is. Just to pull it out of the bag and do something at least. You can't go wrong if you're doing something.
That's right. Okay. Right. So we've talked a bit about tech at the beginning. Katie kind of kicked off to talk about how we could measure the progress of factoring DevSecOps into your pipeline. But from a cultural point of view, and we've kind of touched on this throughout the discussion, there must be war stories that you guys can share. So, you know, a typical comment that I've heard a few times in different organizations is, well, if it's going to take more than 3 seconds to do that security testing in my pipeline, we're not going to use it. So these are, I mean, that's quite extreme. But these are some of the cultural organizational challenges that I faced, and I'm sure some you guys have faced as well. So Wendy, would you like to share some of your war stories?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, in a way, from the sort of conversation, I think because security is such an important, you know, it's got broad level visibility, you know, given the number of attacks that we experience, number of breaches, I think there is an understanding, even for developers, that security is important. I think from the development's point of view, and you know, I completely understand this. They would like to do. It's not that they're kind of going, we're just not doing security. You know, we're not doing scans, and we don't want to remediate our, you know, vulnerabilities, right? I think what they are coming to us to say is, look, you know, we want to do the right thing, and they you know, people do want to do the right thing. Can you please give us a tool that allows us to sort of integrate security and do our testing? You know, whether it's sort of like doing incremental tests, so, you know, whether once I have, you know, written amount of code, or if it's doing ID level, you know, just doing a quick scan as a developer's code. Give us a tool that allow us to do it as painlessly as possible. And what, you know, so when, you know, once you find the vulnerabilities, where they are located, how to remediate it. And, you know, the thing Katie mentioned about false positive, you know, how do we tune the scan engine so that we minimize the number of false positives going forward, and we can mark them and we can exclude them from subsequent scans. I think they're kind of more coming to us on that, rather than sort of, we don't want to do security, because I think there's an understanding that it is important. It's part of it should be part of the backlog. It should be part of, you know, their sort of application development process.
That's great. So, Steve, you've got a strong consultancy background, and you've worked with a number of different organizations. Is there anything you can share from your perspective as a supplier?
I have potentially too many horror stories as a supplier. It's very humbling. Well, it really is. It's very humbling if an organization buys a security tool, it's part of my organization, and then I am brought in to talk about the successful deployment of that, and then I see how difficult it's going to be, and that perhaps we introduced more operational overhead and more friction, and therefore more problems than we actually solved. Which kind of goes back to your how do you choose tools that achieve a low friction interface to the developers, who ultimately kind of decide whether it's going to be successful or not. So understanding and respecting the current culture that you have in an organization, and that the change to that culture isn't going to be as fast as your software development. It's going to be something that you're going to have to drip feed in and I guess I want to say account for when you're using your security tooling. And I think there's several of us have said low friction is good. And I think that's really critical until we have developers through a larger ecosystem and through education coming up through understanding that this is more default behavior. And as you said, Wendy, no, developers don't want to do the wrong thing. They just want to do the fast thing. And the thing that they can even all pull for themselves, which is why open source communities and open source tools are an awesome way in, because they may have already been using them before you start even talking to people like me.
That's great. Okay. So some specific points that I like to flag and for us to actually discuss. So we always use the term CI/CD, and obviously as part of that, we're talking about developing code, testing code, promoting the code into production, etc. So this delivery environment, there's a difference between a development system and a production system. So is there a different? Should the CI stroke CD environments be air gapped, i.e. two different systems, or is it just one ecosystem, and that you have the right security controls to test the artifacts that you're pushing through, as well as the right security control to secure that CI/CD infrastructure? Ashraf, would you like to take this one?
Yeah. No, I don't think you should differentiate. I have these stories. I have many stories as well. I've had many discussions today at work in regards to this notion of things being dev versus UAT versus production, and it's the same thing if you traverse that to CI versus CD. If we say that CI is a production system and CD is also a production system, and you are essentially using the same usernames and identities in CI and CD, and you're using the same flat network in CI and CD, and you're using the same data, then you're just creating friction, and you're just creating a whole load of operational overhead to split the two up. If you indeed have separate identities and separate secrets, and you have a very strong kind of segregated network, and you have a very, very, very good kind of automated, some kind of octopus deployment where you're kind of pulling things from one area and then pushing them into another. If you've got that kind of segregation, and it makes sense. And I would say, look back and think about, is it beneficial? What kind of level of security do you want to achieve? What threat are you actually facing here? So, because I can tell you, if that's what you're really thinking about, you must have a fantastically secure organization. If the one thing that you're actually discussing is whether we should split out CI to CD, I can think of 100 things that you could spend your time on to prevent a breach than to split the CI and CD. So yeah, that's an interesting. If people are honestly, there is a lot you can do other than that. So for me, it's a no. I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze.
So, Katie, in your experience as a platform engineer, and also in the capacity of being a member of the technical committee of CNCF, what's your view on this in terms of, do we split the CI/CD components, environments, or not?
That's, I think, a very good question. I think it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. I would say I cannot really give an answer like, yes, you should do it this way or the other way. I think it depends a lot on the context. I feel that regardless of if we decide to split or not, there should be a transition towards kind of more modern practices and more modern kind of abilities to push your code from your local environment to a production system and through staging and dev and so forth. So I think regardless of what answer is, it's more of like understanding really if that is required. I know it's quite abstract, but it's kind of an abstract question in my emerging lines. But I think regardless of which system it's used, it really should fill the context, and it really should have a kind of transition towards a more kind of innovative way of doing CI/CD. That's definitely should be always in the pipeline. That's always something which should be proactively and constantly thought about and integrated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've talked about testing, lots of different security testing, different security approaches, etc. And it was mentioned that we need to look at the results, eliminate false positive, so reducing the friction between the testing tools and the delivery team. But what is good practice regarding this security testing? Is it a control gate? Is it guidelines? Is it guardrails? I mean, these are terms I've heard, and they may mean different things to different people. But should the security test results define a pass go, a go no go element in terms of the pipeline? Wendy, let's go to you.
Sure. So I think that question, the sort of gating aspect of it, I think it does depend on how mature your kind of organization, your development organization, in terms of their testing, and probably more importantly, remediation. And how do they address the vulnerability, whether they have the capability of addressing the vulnerabilities. I think I think a lot of the developers probably already have a kind of a quality assessment, as it was. So it's not just necessarily security, it's sort of, other QA tests as well, that they sort of kind of, that they pass through a soft gate. I suppose, just reading between the lines, is this a question on whether, as management, whether we essentially stop a code being deployed based on the number of vulnerability? So I think if you're doing that, and I think you probably won't be able to do that with the support of your developers unless you already have a very, very sort of mature kind of organization. And if you're trying to do it without having that, already, where they're already sort of doing it in the first place, I think you need to do it like in a sort of kind of step-by-step way. So, for the first year, medium vulnerabilities. If we see that you have medium vulnerabilities, we're going to stop you. And then the next year you sort of get to sort of, well, high, medium, low, say, sort of, in a stepwise manner, rather than sort of big bang, because you really need their support for that.
Right. So, you're, just to summarize your view, it should be a gated control, but eased in.
If you want a gated control, not every. So the way I say that, so through as a part of this program, I did quite a lot. I did as much market research as possible, right? So gated control, I don't think it's not everybody uses it, but if you want to implement it, it needs to be a stepwise, and you need agreement from your development teams. You kind of say, hey, you're going to do it. I think you can try, but I'm not sure how well that work. Forcing people to do things has not produced fantastic results, in my experience. You really need their buy-in. And I suppose that's the culture side of it.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Let's just get one more opinion regarding this point. Steve, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, well, it depends on, well, first of all, I think that in cloud native and the way we're moving, finding best practice, or even what that means, is we could go with good practice. I'm happy with that term. Some older technologies, it works. I kind of don't mind gating a little bit to actual production deployment if you can define what a trusted application looks like a little bit more beyond CVEs. And if I were talking about containerization, have I left everything running as a root? Like, that would be maybe a total no-go, right? You can get things pretty vastly wrong by default. So maybe having some quite what I would call no-brainer gates in there. So that's maybe okay. But I think starting early and having as many fast feedback loops so that you never really have to get to that process is a good mechanism. Something I saw recently, which I'd never seen before, just to throw that out there, because you were talking about air-gapped environments. I was with an organization that created this kind of security Disneyland, or it was like a plaything pipeline, so that they could see what happened if there were no gates in place or no checks. So everything went through to kind of a mock production. It was fascinating anyway. Gave developers a bit of education.
Interesting.
And
right.
I just want to say, just to reassure everybody, it's not like, I don't mean having utterly no gates, but have possibly, it's you really need their kind of their support, and it's just how to get developer support. That's the yeah. Please let me know if you know of a way of getting sort of developer buy-in in a more frictionless way, as it were.
Building relationships. That's what it's all about.
This is true.
Just buying some cakes. That usually works as well.
It's global. It's how do we send it to
DHL cake? DHL do deliver cake.
46.
Do it. Trust me.
I'm sure there's a local bakery that you can use.
Yeah.
Cake makes the world go round. I think this is what we don't. We need to build cake into the pipeline.
So this is, I suppose, the communities of practice, kind of initiative. Bribe them with pizza and beer, and Sorry, I didn't mean bribe them. Encourage them. Encourage them.
Don't worry, we'll cut that out.
This is live, is it?
Live?
No.
Not everybody.
Encourage them. Encourage them.
What we started, by the way, just real quick, we started the principle of security partners, not champions. So essentially trying to work yourself out of a job. So if you can work yourself out of a job and you don't really need a security team and everyone's a security partner and they can go to the security partners in their department and their teams, then you're slowly getting them to do the security work, and then you don't need to do much, and then eventually you'll get fired and sacked because there's no more work. But that's great because then everything's nice and secure. So that should be the aim, really, to work yourself out of a job.
Yeah,
it should
exactly.
be a subconscious thing.
It's
security.
Yeah. I mean, because the developers, ultimately they're going to have to. They're the people on the ground. They have to take. We can't handhold them forever. So it's part of how to work yourself out of a job and how to educate them so they can actually do it whilst you're working yourself out of a job.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And
we're coming
just
up.
to finish this from an end user perspective, one sentence is, I completely agree with all of these points. But I think the most important thing when actually trying to propagate the DevSecOps practice is start small and integrate graciously, because from our point of view is we don't want like a ginormous pipeline built for us and just pushed on us and we have to deal with it. We want something which we understand and with something we can build on top of. And this is exactly how the practice of outgrow yourself of your own role. It's going to, because we're going to have these small steps, we're going to learn step by step, we're going to have this coaching culture. This is going to be, I think, one of the best ways, paved roads that we can move towards. And the developers actually agree with that. I can confirm that. And cakes is always better.
Told you, or just cakes, or just cakes.
Beautiful.
Yeah, cake is a service.
Let's end on that wonderful note. So thank you very much, Wendy, Katie, Steve, Grant, Ashraf, for joining me on this panel. Thank you, DevSecCon, for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.